So as you can see, there's quite a few dents here. The front looks like somebody's kicked its teeth in with the side of a truck. And then this is the big old dent. So this one might take a sledgehammer to pull out because it's pretty deep. But it's nice thick sheet metal on the side of the trailer, so should be able to get that skin back looking pretty nice. Other than that, it's in relatively good shape, as you've seen, so we'll get back at her. So while I wait for the paint to dry inside before I can weld in the roof support, I'm gonna tackle bashing out this nice big old dent. So we'll have to take off this aluminum checker plate, get inside and whack it with the old persuader.
Now, if you're used to working with automotive sheet metal, this is a whole different beast. The trailer skin is 1/8" plate steel, so getting it to move takes quite a bit more effort. And holding a small hand dolly to back a swing from a 4-pound machinist hammer, well, let's just say that's not the best idea I've ever had. Other than the effort required, it's pretty much the same process though. Move the metal, relieve the stress, rinse and repeat. Now, I'm not going for a showroom finish at this stage. I'll be using fiberglass reinforced body filler and then some regular polyester body filler to smooth things out. It just needs to be close so that I can minimize the thickness of the body filler to mitigate cracking.
Alright, so this area doesn't have to be perfect because it's going to be covered up by the aluminum checker plate. However, we will have to cut a patch out here and re-weld it in because we're quite rotten out here. And if we look at it on this side, we can clearly see how rotten it is. So we're seeing daylight, and if we get right down in here, you can see that the actual support itself is rusted out, so we're going to have to repair this as well.
If you watched the first video, you'll see that I've already repaired the front support and fixed the sheet metal. That repair went fairly well and should definitely hold up for another 45 years or so. Now I'm moving on to repairing the roof structural member and sealing the roof skin. To start, I drilled out all the old rivets, peeled back the roof skin as much as possible without putting any more creases into it, and exposed the joints for the roof support member so I could cut it out. I used a Sawzall and grinder to cut out the rusty old roof support and ground down the lap seams prior to paint. I sprayed the lap seams with rust converter before moving on to cutting the new roof support, and let's just say I learned a valuable lesson that we'll find out soon. After cutting the roof support to length, I cleaned it with a wax and grease remover. And don't worry, I'm not just going to use a dirty old shop rag, I was just getting an excessive amount of oil covering it off first. After a good wipe down, I sprayed it with an etching primer and then top coated with some trim clad to keep it from rusting until I sprayed the inside of the trailer. It's super humid here right now, and I'm very close to the ocean, so exposed metal rusts in about 2 hours. And now to see the valuable lesson that I learned.
Well, the primer created by the rust converter did not interact well with the trim-clad paint. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to strip off all of the paint that I put on the roof underneath the lap seam, as well as around these rails. So that's going to be a pain, but got to do it. Got to make sure that this cures up, and it's been drying for over 15 hours and it's still tacky. So time to take it off. All right, so finally ready to reinstall the roof support. So we'll use a couple magnets to hold it in place, maybe a clamp on this side. And then we should be good to weld that in there, and then we can rivet the roof skin back into place. I feel like we're finally making some progress, and hopefully we'll be able to address patching up the windows and cutting out the service door pretty quick here.
Now again, if you watch the first video, you'll see that I've in fact patched up the windows, so I'll save you watching that again. If you haven't seen it, well, no better time than after this video to go back and watch the first one. Really though, stick around to the end of the video, because the final reveal of the interior is worth it. Hey, I said watch it, don't skip to the end.
Now I'll just make sure that it looks straight because it wasn't originally straight. So the roof skin needs to still line up. We'll make it as good as we can, but we got to make sure that we can get the holes into the flat of the metal. Good, so we're nice and squared up. Looks like all the rivet holes will still line up, so we're good to weld it in there. So now we're going to seal the roof before we put in the rivets. That'll make sure it stays watertight for a long, long time.
Riveting the skin back on was very satisfying, and actually worked out better than I'd hoped. I first used a couple of ratchet straps to hold everything in place, then drilled up the new roof support using the existing rivet holes in the skin. I applied the automotive sealant to the lap seams, and a gob of sealant on each of the rivet holes, and then a pneumatic rivet gun that I picked up at Princess Auto for about 40 bucks made short work of the rest. And now begins what may have been my least favorite part of the trailer build so far, cleaning up the inside to prep it for paint. This involved a little grinding and a lot, and I mean a lot, of sanding. Well, thinking back, maybe this is tied for worst job with grinding the frame, but at least that didn't put my whole arms to sleep like sanding the roof did. One of the reasons I left my career as a plumber and got my PhD was because after my shoulder surgery, my shoulder really can't handle doing much overhead work. So yeah, long story short, this sucked. But the effort was well worth it. And now a quick wipe down with wax and grease remover, and we'll be ready for paint.
Alright, so finally got the trailer prepped and ready for paint. We're going to be using some Tremclad primer to start off. We'll be using a 4 parts Tremclad to 1 part acetone mix to help it spray through the gun. Since I don't have a decent enough air compressor, we're just going to be using an electric paint sprayer. Should do a decent enough job as soon as we can dial in the settings. So if it works, I'll let you know. If it doesn't work, I will be buying a new compressor and air gun, and we'll paint it that way. But got my paint vapor rated cartridges for my respirator, some nice goggles, Tyvek suit, so should be good to go. We'll start off by mixing up some of the Tremclad. So you gotta make sure you get it mixed well. Otherwise you won't have enough of the solid particles in it. So the oil kind of settles on top. If you can get it shaken up in store, that's even better than mixing, but once you have it at home, you don't really want to be shaking it up. You're better off mixing it. It avoids getting bubbles in the paint. Now the worst part of this process is pouring it from the can into the little mixing cup. So we'll see what we can do to avoid making a mess, but my guess is it's going to make one heck of a mess on my table. I'm just going to lay down a cloth to catch any of the spilled paint. Oh, not too shabby. All right, we are basically bang on the 6, a little bit below or a little bit above, so we'll go just a smidge above on the acetone as well. You don't need to be exactly 4:1, just something somewhat resembling that. Okay, so we're right about on target. Made a good mess with the acetone. And we'll just take our mixing stick and mix it in nice and well. Now, if you make it too diluted, it's not gonna stick very well. It'll just run down the sides of the trailer here. But if you don't dilute it enough, then you end up with a mix that's not sprayable. So it's all about getting the right balance of viscosity. So the lower your viscosity, the easier it is to spray. So low viscosity means you've added more acetone. And the acetone, since it's a solvent, will help it flash off just a little bit quicker too. Now, if you do have access, you can buy some catalyst, and that'll help it flash off even faster. Unfortunately, the stores I went to didn't have any catalyst available, so we're stuck just diluting it with a little bit of acetone. Now, once you have it mixed up, you're going to want to go ahead and strain it using either a paint filter or some cheesecloth. When you pour it into the gun, whether you're using an air gun or an electric gun. So we'll just use a little layer of cheesecloth there. And that will just catch any of the larger particles. All right, I'll get kitted up to spray and we'll see what we can do. All right, actually pressing record this time. So I've got the gun settings pretty dialed in. It's laying down a nice, decent coat. Should be good enough for what we're doing with the primer.
Getting the primer on went pretty smoothly. I think the 4:1 ratio was perfect for the airless sprayer, and the finish came out surprisingly smooth with no runs. You'll notice that I left the door and part of the wall bare. This is because I haven't decided what I'm going to do with the front door yet, and I'll be cutting the side panel out to be the service door.
So I let the primer cure for about 24 hours and it's time to top coat it with some gloss white trim clad. So just like the primer, we'll mix up a 4:1 ratio. So we're using our trusty mixing cup here, and we'll be doing 2 coats of the trim clad. So it's got to wait 24 hours between coats, but it should flash off in about 4 to 6 hours. So it's a little bit windy today, might get a bit of dust, but the dilution with acetone should help things dry a bit quicker, so we're less likely to get dust in the paint. But it will all be covered up, so if it does get a little bit of dust, it's not the end of the world. So we'll mix up a coat of the white paint here, get it sprayed on, and then we'll let it sit for the day and paint it again tomorrow. And for our first coat, we'll be doing a nice light coat. So we want the paint to stick to the primer and dry really nicely. And if you put it on too thick, you can get runs. And we're not really worried about coverage for the first coat. We're just worried about getting the paint on there. And then our second coat will be a medium heavy coat. and that'll make sure that we have full coverage on everything. So when I sprayed the primer, we were about 1.5 cups of paint, or 1.5 batches of paint in the mixing cup. So what I'll probably do is just mix that all up right away, and that way I don't have to come back and remix after spraying. Now, I found it wasn't super necessary to use the cheesecloth yesterday because this is nice fresh paint, so it doesn't really have any clumps that we're worried about in it. So I'm just going to go ahead and pour it right in. And then once we have this second batch mixed, I'll stir it all together inside of my paint pot just to make sure that we have an even mixture of paint. Now, just in case we need a little bit more, I won't clean up my cup yet. But with this, we should be good to go.
Now, this part was even more satisfying than getting the roof skin back on. Everything is looking so much nicer with a good coat of white paint, and it sprayed very easily once the gun was dialed in. I had a little bit of extra paint left over when I was spraying the second coat, so I coated the frame and the side panel. And to answer your question, no, I didn't sand the Por 15 prior to spraying, but I did wipe it down with wax and grease remover. And here's the finished product. So yeah, the Tremclad's probably going to peel off in some spots, and that's okay, because the Por 15 is an insanely durable finish on its own. Thanks for sticking around till the end of the video. Check back in for the next video where we'll be tackling wiring the trailer, well, at least the trailer wiring harness, and cutting the plywood for the new floors.